Hello and welcome to the Atoll, your home for Waterworld fandom. In today's lore-focused deep dive, we'll be exploring everything we know about how Earth became flooded to create Waterworld in an event called the Great Deluge. So without further ado, let's plunge in and watch those ocean waters rise. In the film, we are first introduced to the concept of a flooded Earth as soon as the movie begins with the now famous Universal logo takeover. The Universal logo bursts onto screen like in many of our favorite 90s films and proudly declares that this movie you're about to experience is a Universal Pictures project. But then the text dissolves away and we begin to zoom in. As we zoom in, the polar ice caps begin to melt and the continents start to disappear under a blue shroud. We then hear the tones of legendary voiceover talent Hal Douglas, who informs us, quote, "The future. The polar ice caps have melted, covering the Earth with water. Those who survived have adapted to a new world." And then we descend into the clouds and the film's title appears, Waterworld. And so on its face, it would seem pretty clear how Waterworld was flooded. The effects of global warming have melted the ice caps, raising the sea levels, flooding all of dry land. Though I should note that the film never directly calls out climate change as the cause for the ice caps melting. Director Kevin Reynolds wanted to create what he called an eco-fable, and subtly hint that mankind had caused the calamity which resulted in the flooding of Earth. And this is reinforced by the film's environmental undertones, with lines of dialogue in the film from characters like the Mariner and Gregor that hint at the endless oceans being the fault of the ancients. And also, in the first teaser trailer for Waterworld, we are told that the sun, once a source of life on Earth, is now a source of its demise, and that as the temperatures rose, so did the oceans. Furthermore, in the Waterworld novelization, we can see that climate change was also on the mind of writer Max Allan Collins as the cause of the Great Deluge, in the scene where the Mariner looks through his stash of National Geographic magazines. Among them is an issue from 1999 which contains article titles like Global Warming, a Reality, Death of the Rainforests, and Pollution Spiral. And in the film, we can also see 4 different issues of National Geographic that the Mariner has collected, 2 of which are actual real issues from 1930 and 1981, and 2 from unknown years that were made specifically for the production of the film, one which presents us with the title Paradise Lost, with an image of a tropical forest and an angry ocean lapping at its roots, and another with the title Whither Goes Man, and images of lightning and flooded cities. But you're probably wondering, how much would the seas actually rise if all the ice on Earth was to completely melt? Well, according to articles by Business Insider and National Geographic themselves, if all the ice in the world were to melt, the oceans would rise over 200 feet, which is far from covering all of dry land, but would of course be absolutely devastating, flooding all coastal regions and displacing about 40% of the Earth's population. The melting of the world's fresh water supply would also dilute salt waters, completely changing ocean currents and weather patterns as we presently know them. But even with mass destruction and unimaginable harm to the Earth, there is no way that the melting of all ice currently on the planet could possibly cover all of dry land and water. So what could explain for the extra water present in Waterworld? For that answer, we must turn to the comic book series, Waterworld, The Children of the Leviathan. In the opening pages of comic number 1, we plunge right into a dream that the Mariner is having, which in a past video I speculated is a genetic memory and actually shows us dry land as we know it today, succumbing to the rising waters of the Great Deluge. And on this page, we also see that the Earth is being bombarded by asteroids, which the comic calls Icy Death. But before we go any further, it should be known that the origin of water on Earth's surface is not completely known, but scientists theorize that water was delivered from the outer solar system after the formation of the Sun. Many geological studies have concluded that asteroids containing ice were likely the primary source of Earth's water, and that its perfect size and proximity to the Sun has allowed the water to be obtained in liquid form on its surface. So it would seem that the comic book is suggesting that man-made climate change is not the only contributor to Earth's flooding, but also these asteroids containing frozen water, or Icy Death, contributed to climate change and, more importantly, brought the extra water from outer space to flood all of Dryland. A big shout out to friend of the channel Lane W and his website waterworldmovie.com for help on explaining this concept of Icy Death. And I have to wonder, could the ancients on Earth have caused the raining down of Icy Death, also called the spaceborne disaster later in the comics? After all, we learn from the comics that there are 4 foundations, large underwater bunkers that house their own societies, and that these were built right before the Great Deluge. Could the original inhabitants of the foundations have built these bunkers in preparation for an apocalypse of their own causing? I also feel it needs to be mentioned that the Icy Death asteroids could help explain the reversed poles subplot in the film. In my deep dive video on the mysteries of Enola's tattoo here on this channel, I explained that the Earth's magnetic poles could have potentially flipped due to a disruption to the flow of the Earth's inner core from an external impact event. So could the Icy Death in the comics have caused the poles to reverse themselves, making it difficult to decipher the tattoo map on Enola's back in the film? Well, yes, I think it's highly likely. But in any regard, later in the film, we do know that our companions finally do find the fabled Dryland, and as many of you know, in the extended cut of Waterworld, we learn that Dryland is in fact the top of Mount Everest, when Helen and Enola discover a plaque commemorating Tenzing Norgay and Sir Edmund Hillary as the first mountaineers to summit the peak. And from this, we can assume that the ocean levels have risen nearly 29,000 feet above our current sea level. And this calls into question why Denver, Colorado, which we can see in the diving scene earlier in the film, is only around 400 feet underwater, with the city being at a current elevation of 5,200 feet above sea level. If we are to believe that the ocean levels rose 29,000 feet, the city of Denver should sit nearly 23,800 feet below the surface of Waterworld. So perhaps, and this is just a fan theory, some sort of tectonic movement perhaps triggered by the asteroid bombardment seen in the comics has forced the middle of North America upwards, bringing the city closer to the surface of the ocean. But regardless, as we can see in the film, Dryland rises significantly from the surface of the ocean, with mountains and enormous waterfalls at its shoreline. In reality, the scene was shot in Waipio Valley, on the Big Island of Hawaii, and the mountain bluffs surrounding the valley are approximately 2,000 feet above sea level. So, this would indicate that the oceans actually rose to around 27,000 feet above our current sea level, or 2,000 feet below the height of Mount Everest at 29,000 feet. This makes us wonder, are there any other mountains in the world that lie between 27,000 feet and 29,000 feet above sea level? And in fact, yes, there are a total of 4 other peaks that fit into this categorization: K2, Mount Kinchinjunga, Mount Laotse, and Mount Maklu. These other peaks are also part of the Himalayan range with the exception of K2, which is part of the nearby Karakoram range. So it would seem that dry land found in the film may not be the only island on the oceans of Waterworld, and perhaps this is something that can be explored in the upcoming Waterworld TV show if that project ever goes into production. But where else in the existing Waterworld greater lore can we see mention of the Great Deluge? Well, let's begin by looking at Peter Rader's original script, which begins with a title card that reads, "The Warming Age began after the Great Thaw of the Cold War. Free markets heated up and the ice caps slowly melted. Little by little, the globe became one seamless ocean. The survivors scavenged rafts, buoys, anything that could float. As hope of finding water's end slowly faded, sweet water became scarce, and the wars began anew." So we can see that even Waterworld's earliest inceptions contained the ideas that our present system of consumption at the end of the 20th century would lead to a, quote, warming age, melting the ice caps and flooding the earth as the survivors fought over what little vital resources remain. According to the Making of Waterworld book, Rader's original notes for the script had told of nuclear war melting the ice caps, which is perhaps reflected in the Cold War line in the original script I just read. And it was perhaps not until writer David Twohy was brought on board that the film received its true environmental undertones when he introduced the conflicting philosophies of the Atollers, who believed in living sustainably upon Waterworld, and the Smokers, who believed that there will always be another place to pillage. In the video games of Waterworld, the Great Deluge is hinted at in many of the opening scrolls as you start up the games. The Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo versions use the same dialogue as the teaser trailer mentioned earlier in this video. And of the video games, it is the PC game, Waterworld: The Quest for Dryland, that by far has the most lore associated with the Great Deluge in it. In the opening live-action cutscene at the beginning of the game, old Gregor, who is played in this version by John Fleck, who played the smoker Doc in the actual film, appears to us and tells us that the Earth's inhabitants believe that Waterworld was created by the Great Deluge from a single drop of water. He tells us that the people believe that the materials, like the floating plastic that makes up the atolls, are from the gods, but Gregor tells us that this is far from the truth, that dry land existed everywhere, and that the ancient people went too far with their cities and machines, and that Earth rebelled by melting all of the frozen hydro, and the eye of God closed on humanity. He tells us that the world was not created by the Great Deluge, it was covered by it. The film and novelization also presents similar folklore in regards to the creation of Waterworld, with lines of dialogue from Helen, who believes, before she's taken to the sunken city at the end of the story, that Dryland floats and that it was washed away by the Great Deluge. But in the film and novelization, it does seem at times that the inhabitants of Waterworld understand that there was a time of land before the water, with terms like "in the land days" or how the Deacon has such an acute understanding of golf course design. But going back to the PC game, at the end, Gregor comes back and tells us about how, if man never discovered dry land again, the dry land would flourish without mankind, and he even says that the floodwaters of the Great Deluge would eventually recede and restore the continents. And I recently acquired the instruction manual for the Quest for Dryland game, which contains even more lore pertaining to the Great Deluge. In the section Plot Background, it explicitly says that global warming caused the ice caps to melt, and in the very back of the manual there's a section called Additional Material, which gives a sort of timeline of events as the Great Deluge overtook the Earth. In an entry from the year 2040, it describes sea levels rising by a meter in the past 5 years, with scientists calling for swift action to mitigate the melting of the polar ice caps. It also shows that Jefferson Pillock, spokesman of CLEAN, a lobby group for the chemical and oil industry, says that the scientists are being alarmist and that there's plenty of time left. Another entry from the year 2157 describes the failed efforts to hold back the ocean waters in Wales as a large retaining wall collapses and the water submerged the high elevation villages in that area. The final entry is from the year 2200 and describes the formation of the atoll societies as they attack some of the last remnants of land in the high mountains of Bolivia. Only the ultra-wealthy can afford to live there as the atoll societies starve on the ever-growing oceans. The wealthy mountain communities pressure their president to mobilize airstrikes against the atollers. And I really love these additional pieces of lore presented in the PC game. They are highly sarcastic, and I think they match the more satirical environmental commentary that we see in the film. And I think there may be even more hidden lore within the game, as you are rewarded newspaper and magazine clippings after successful missions, but only one has ever been documented here on the internet. This one is from the year 2044 and emphasizes the importance of collecting and chronicling paper materials for future generations as the Great Deluge begins to swallow up the Earth. I would really love to do a complete playthrough of the Quest for Dryland and document all the other newspaper clippings in the game. I just have to figure out how to get the game running on my modern MacBook. If you have any expertise in this and would like to help me out, let me know in the comments below. Now turning to the Waterworld Fleer Ultra Trading Cards number 1, which makes reference to the Great Deluge, telling us that the polar ice caps have melted and that humanity is on the brink of extinction. Waterworld, a live Sea War spectacular, the live stunt show now at 4 Universal theme parks across the world, also makes reference to the melting of the ice caps to create Waterworld in the opening voiceover that sets up the story about to unfold in front of the audience, which is also voiced by Hal Douglas as it is in the film. And I think it's really interesting to note that flooding myths and stories are present in almost all religions and societies, from the Christian tale of Noah, to the Greek story of Deucalion, to the Buddhist tale of Samudra Vanija Jataka, to the Chinese folklore of a farmer capturing the god of thunder who in revenge created a great flood. I believe that humans have always been fascinated by a flooded Earth, and this is what makes Waterworld such an alluring film to me. And I really hope that if the supposed Waterworld TV series ever goes into production, that the writers will dive deeper into what we know as the Great Deluge. But there you have it, that is everything we currently know about the Great Deluge of Waterworld. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please consider giving it a thumbs up before you leave, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the Atoll. We just hit the astonishing milestone of 1,000 subscribers, and I am so thankful to everyone who has followed me along on this journey. But also, follow the Atoll on Instagram for even more Waterworld content and updates on future videos. But with that, thanks, as always, for joining me at the Atoll.